Most countries have founding myths, tales of revolution, ancient empires, or peaceful treaties that are less about historical accuracy and more about national identity. These stories are not just about what happened, they're about what gets remembered, and more importantly, what gets forgotten. In China's case, the past has been carefully curated to support a present-day vision, one in which the nation is vast, united, and eternally indivisible. But this version of history is less a reflection of ancient continuity and more a product of modern conquest, reshaped borders, and aggressive assimilation. China, as it exists today on the map, is enormous. About 9.6 million square kilometers, making it the third largest country on Earth. Yet for much of its history, what we now call China was confined to the central plains around the Yellow and Yangtze rivers, the Han Heartland. Regions like Tibet, Xinjiang, and Inner Mongolia were distant territories with distinct cultures, languages, and political systems. They were not historically Chinese in the way the Communist Party claims. These areas were brought into the fold not through shared heritage, but through military campaigns, political manipulation, and, later, deep-rooted systems of control. The expansion of China into these regions didn't come from a timeless empire expanding organically over millennia. Instead, it was driven by modern political needs, particularly during the early years of the People's Republic of China. After the communist victory in the Civil War in 1949, Mao Zedong and his government inherited a fractured landscape. The Republic of China had collapsed, and what remained was a patchwork of warlord-run territories and autonomous regions, many of which were acting as independent states. The communist leadership viewed reclaiming these territories as essential, not only to restore what they saw as historical borders, but to project strength and legitimacy at home and abroad. Xinjiang, Tibet, and Inner Mongolia became central targets in this campaign. Xinjiang, in the far northwest, was vast and resource-rich, but loosely governed by local Muslim leaders and Soviet-backed factions. In late 1949, communist officials negotiated a surrender rather than launch a full-scale military invasion. Though several Uyghur and Kazakh leaders died in a mysterious plane crash en route to meet Mao, the region came under communist control with little immediate resistance. It added a massive chunk of territory to the new Chinese state, 1.6 million square kilometers of deserts, mountains, and borderlands. Tibet was next. Unlike Xinjiang, Tibet had governed itself since the fall of the Qing dynasty in 1912. It had its own army, government, and foreign relations. Yet, to the Communist Party, Tibet was part of the imperial legacy they had inherited, and that meant it had to return. In 1950, the People's Liberation Army crossed into eastern Tibet, overwhelming the poorly equipped local forces. By 1951, Tibetan leaders signed a heavily pressured agreement that declared Tibet part of China, under promises of autonomy that would later be broken. The party framed this as a peaceful liberation, claiming to rescue Tibetans from a feudal theocracy. But to most Tibetans, it was an invasion, one that erased their sovereignty. Inner Mongolia was a somewhat different case. By the time the PRC was founded in 1949, many local Mongol leaders had already aligned with communist forces. The region had long been contested ground, swinging between Chinese and Mongol rule. After the collapse of the Qing, Outer Mongolia broke away and aligned with the Soviet Union. But Inner Mongolia remained under Chinese control. In 1947, the CCP preemptively established the Inner Mongolia Autonomous Region, setting a precedent for how it would manage ethnic minorities. Rather than full independence or equal federalism, these regions were given the appearance of autonomy while remaining under strict central control. With these regions secured, China didn't just grow in size, it shifted demographically and culturally. Nearly half of the PRC's landmass today is composed of areas that were not historically Han Chinese and were only brought under central rule in the mid-20th century. The state calls them autonomous regions. But autonomy exists largely in name. These territories have been steadily transformed through infrastructure, migration, education, and ideology. To cement control, the government began a slow but deliberate process of assimilation. In places like Xinjiang and Inner Mongolia, the influx of Han Chinese settlers, often encouraged or directly organized by the state, changed the population balance dramatically. Xinjiang, which was once more than 90% Uyghur, now sees near parity between Han and Uyghur populations. Inner Mongolia, historically Mongol, is now dominated by Han residents. The same pattern is unfolding in Tibet, albeit at a slower pace due to geographic and logistical challenges. But even there, roads, railways, and migration are beginning to reshape the region. The education system plays a critical role. Mandarin is promoted as the national language and often becomes the sole medium of instruction in schools. Local languages, while officially permitted, are marginalized. History textbooks present a singular narrative. These regions were always part of China and were liberated by the Communist Party. Stories of independence, cultural distinctiveness, and religious heritage are omitted or reframed as backward and regressive. Children grow up reciting patriotic slogans and singing the national anthem, their classrooms adorned with portraits of Mao and Xi Jinping. Identity is being overwritten not with violence alone, but with repetition, routine, and curriculum. This transformation is not accidental, it's strategic. To maintain control over regions that were never truly Chinese in the nationalistic sense, the state needs more than soldiers and surveillance. It needs a story that people believe, one that can outlive those who remember otherwise. And so history is rewritten, memory is manipulated, and resistance becomes treason. The early victories of the Chinese Communist Party in absorbing vast frontier regions weren't just territorial wins. They laid the foundation for a larger geopolitical vision. With domestic consolidation mostly achieved by the 1950s, the CCP's gaze began drifting toward unfinished business along its borders and into the sea. These were not just disputes over land or islands. They were about rewriting history, asserting lost dignity, and expanding influence under the guise of restoration. This part of the story is not just about what China wants to reclaim, but how it uses the past to justify its present ambitions. Take Taiwan. From Beijing's point of view, Taiwan is not a separate country. It's a temporarily estranged province. The Chinese government insists that Taiwan has always been a part of China, citing everything from Qing dynasty maps to nationalist declarations. But the truth is more complicated. While the Qing did control Taiwan for some time, they lost it to Japan in 1895. After World War II, Taiwan was handed over to the Republic of China, not the People's Republic. When Mao's communists took over the mainland in 1949, the nationalists fled to Taiwan and continued to govern there. Since then, Taiwan has developed its own democracy, identity, and economy. It elects its own leaders, prints its own currency, and maintains foreign relations under a different name. But none of that matters to Beijing. To them, letting Taiwan go would be the ultimate loss of face and a dangerous precedent for other restive regions. The official line is reunification. The real goal is submission. Over the years, China has tried various tactics to reclaim Taiwan: military threats, diplomatic pressure, economic incentives, cyber warfare, and aggressive propaganda. Every time a country establishes relations with Taiwan or sells it weapons, Beijing lashes out. It poaches Taiwan's allies, blocks its participation in global forums, and floods social media with disinformation. But perhaps the most telling sign of its intentions lies in its military posture. China now conducts regular war games around Taiwan. Its jets breach Taiwanese airspace, its navy circles the island, and its state media airs simulations of a full-scale invasion. All of this is wrapped in historical language. Taiwan, they say, is the last piece of the puzzle. But Taiwan isn't the only target of this revisionist ambition. Further south lies the South China Sea, a vast body of water stretching from China's southern coast to the shores of Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, and beyond. International law, specifically the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, gives coastal states the right to economic zones up to 200 nautical miles from their shores. But China doesn't accept this framework. Instead, it uses something called the 9-dash line, an old map drawn up in the 1940s that claims nearly the entire sea as Chinese territory. This claim cuts into the economic zones of several other nations and encompasses critical shipping lanes, rich fishing grounds, and untapped energy reserves. To assert control, China has built artificial islands on submerged reefs, turning them into military outposts with runways, radar stations, and missile systems. These man-made islands have allowed China to extend its military reach deep into the heart of Southeast Asia. When other countries protest or try to enforce their claims, Chinese vessels ram fishing boats, block coast guards, and intimidate rivals into backing down. In 2016, an international tribunal ruled that China's claims had no legal basis. Beijing simply ignored it. In their eyes, international law is secondary to historical rights, a version of history they control. Meanwhile, in the Himalayas, another front has quietly emerged. The long, winding border between India and China has been a source of tension for decades, but in recent years it's gotten more dangerous. Skirmishes have turned deadly. Troops from both sides have clashed with fists, clubs, and stones. No bullets, just raw force. In 2020, a brutal confrontation in the Galwan Valley left 20 Indian soldiers dead, along with an unknown number of Chinese casualties. At the heart of these clashes are competing maps. China claims parts of Indian-administered Ladakh and Arunachal Pradesh as its own, citing old treaties and imperial-era surveys. India, of course, rejects these claims. But the pattern is familiar. China asserts historical ownership, then reinforces it with presence and force. These aren't isolated disputes. They're part of a broader strategy to reframe China's borders not as they are today, but as the CCP believes they should be, based on a selective memory of the past. This is why understanding history matters. Because when history becomes a weapon, the past isn't just remembered, it's reenacted. And yet, what makes China's expansionist ambitions so effective isn't just military or economic power. It's the ability to control the narrative. Domestically, dissenting voices are suppressed, alternative versions of events are banned, and historical scholarship is tightly regulated. In Chinese textbooks, the South China Sea belongs to China because it always has. Taiwan is painted as a rebellious province, not a sovereign state. The border skirmishes with India are framed as Chinese self-defense. This carefully curated version of history is taught in schools, reinforced in the media, and embedded in everyday life. But China isn't content with controlling the narrative at home. Increasingly, it's trying to export it abroad. Through state-run media, Confucius Institutes, and partnerships with foreign universities, the CCP is trying to shape how the rest of the world sees its history. It spends billions on global PR campaigns, promotes Chinese language media overseas, and pressures foreign companies, politicians, and even celebrities to avoid any statement that contradicts its views. Maps are a battleground. In Hollywood, in textbooks, in software, China demands that Taiwan be shown as part of China, that the 9-dash line be respected, that contested regions be labeled in its favor, and often the world complies. Not because they agree, but because they're afraid of losing access to the Chinese market. This is the new frontier of power, not just seizing land, but seizing the narrative, not just silencing opposition, but rewriting memory. And as long as that story is left unchallenged, the CCP's vision of history, however selective or distorted, continues to gain ground. So where does this all lead? China's strategy isn't just about maps, borders, or even national pride. It's about establishing a new world order, one where China sits at the center. The playbook is clear. Use history as a tool, deploy economic leverage as a weapon, and back it all with military might. Whether it's the Belt and Road Initiative tying dozens of countries into debt-dependent infrastructure deals, or the quiet acquisition of critical ports and telecom networks across Africa, Europe, and Latin America, China isn't just playing defense. It's building an empire without calling it one, and it's working. Countries that once pushed back now tread carefully. ASEAN members avoid directly confronting China over the South China Sea. African leaders, reliant on Chinese loans, rarely criticize Beijing. European governments face pressure from their own corporations to avoid angering the CCP. Even the United States, despite its power, finds itself in a constant balancing act, supporting Taiwan militarily while trying to avoid open conflict. But here's the thing, this isn't inevitable, it's a choice. Every time a country stays silent to protect a trade deal, every time a company censors itself to access a market, every time a scholar hesitates to publish out of fear of backlash, China's version of history gains ground. And with it, so does its control over the future. Because when you control history, you don't just justify what you've done, you prepare the world for what you're about to do. So the next time someone tells you China is just reclaiming what's theirs, ask whose version of history they're using. Ask who benefits from that narrative. And more importantly, ask what happens when the rest of the world starts believing it too.